What if the very walls of a peaceful village cottage could whisper the one secret powerful enough to destroy an entire family's legacy? What if behind every smile there was a silent screaming to be heard? In the heart of a quiet town buried beneath decades of dust and denial, lies a truth so painful, so deeply hidden, that even time dared not disturb it until now. This is not just a story of crime or justice, it's a haunting tale of shame, silence, and the fragile cost of truth. And once you begin, you won't be able to walk away, because some secrets were never meant to stay buried. In the hushed, moss-covered village of Eldon Hollow, where fog clung to chimney pots like secrets too old to forget, and even the wind carried the hush of forgotten prayers, death did not knock, it whispered, slipping through creaking floorboards and over weathered tombstones without disturbing so much as a single petal in the churchyard. And when Miss Cordelia Wren passed away in her shuttered manor nestled deep within Thornapple Wood, not a single villager claimed to be surprised, though few could say with certainty that she had still been alive in the weeks leading up to it. She had become a spectral presence long before her death, her name spoken with a blend of curiosity and caution, her silhouette sometimes glimpsed through rain-laced windows as if she belonged to the manor more than the world. Wren Hollow House, with its ivy-entombed stone walls, crooked chimneys, and shutters nailed shut from the inside, had become something between a house and a legend. The locals, wrapped in their routines and layered suspicions, gave the manor a wide berth, especially after Evelyn Carr arrived, a sharp-featured woman from the city whose footsteps made no sound and whose eyes seemed to catalogue everything and everyone, yet reveal nothing. Introduced as a distant great-niece, Evelyn had moved into the manor 2 years earlier under the pretense of companionship and care, but no one saw the two women together, and rumors began to twist like creeping vines. Had Cordelia gone mad? Was she bedridden? Had Evelyn come to inherit or to hide? Then, just after a bitter rainstorm in late November, word quietly emerged: Miss Wren had died, alone, unremarked, with the doctor called only after Evelyn had found the body, which the villagers noted had seemingly been lifeless for days. The funeral was held at dawn as grey light seeped through skeletal trees, and the only attendees were Evelyn, the local curate who looked distinctly uncomfortable, and a gravedigger who never once looked up from the soil. No bell tolled, no obituary was posted, no mourning garb was worn. It might have ended there, another eccentric fading into forgotten village folklore, had it not been for the arrival, 3 days after the burial, of a strange envelope that would unravel what little certainty the village had about the house, the air, and the dead. Pale dove-grey, sealed in burgundy wax stamped with a crescent emblem unfamiliar to even Mrs. Pike, the postmistress of 37 years, the envelope bore Cordelia's full name, written in long spidery European cursive, and its postmark, Vienna, was dated precisely 1 day before her death. Mrs. Pike, a quiet but observant woman who had once been a codebreaker in the war, and never quite left the habit of noticing what others missed, said the handwriting was neither sentimental nor businesslike, but deliberate, as if whoever wrote it had no doubt it would be read. When Evelyn arrived that morning, she did not ask if there was post, she simply reached out her hand as if she already knew what had arrived. Her expression did not shift, no surprise, no confusion, not even a flicker of hesitation, as she slid the letter into the inner pocket of her coat, thanked Mrs. Pike, and left with the same measured steps that had marked her first arrival in the village. But that evening, strange things began to occur. A light burned in the east wing of Wren Hollow House, long believed to be sealed, and the smell of ink and burnt paper drifted over the hedges. Several villagers claimed they heard piano music, faint and fractured, notes tumbling like forgotten memories from behind the darkened windows, though no piano had been heard in the manor for over a decade. One child swore she saw a figure in a high-backed chair facing the window, a figure whose posture did not resemble Evelyn's at all. Days later, Evelyn announced, via a typed note pinned to the chapel door, that she would be leaving the village permanently, with no forwarding address, and the manor was once again abandoned. But before she vanished, one final oddity occurred. A groundskeeper found the grey envelope tucked into the hollow of the twisted oak that bordered the property, the same tree that had once been struck by lightning and split open like a wound. The wax seal was broken, but the letter itself had vanished, leaving behind only the faint smell of lavender, and something far older, something like ash or time. No one saw Evelyn leave, and no vehicle was heard that morning. The house has remained sealed since then, yet villagers still whisper that shadows move within it at night, and sometimes, just sometimes, a letter arrives at the post office addressed to Miss Cordelia Wren, in the same elegant handwriting, always with a foreign postmark, and always unclaimed. Mrs. Pike, now retired, keeps them in a box she never opens, and warns the new postmistress never to return them, only to wait, because as she once told a friend in confidence, some letters are not written to be read by the living. It was not the letter itself, nor even the arrival of it, but the weight of silence wrapped around its presence that unsettled the air in Lydney Marsh, a silence too deliberate, too careful, and far too restrained for it to be brushed aside as trivial. Until now, Julia Grover's icy demeanor had always seemed a personal trait, a quirk of character perhaps molded by years of solitude and inherited austerity. But with the letter's sudden emergence and her palpable unwillingness to mention it, the villagers felt an imperceptible shift, as though they'd all been looking at a portrait they thought they understood, only to have the light change and reveal something chilling beneath. From beneath the flowering hawthorn tree in her goddaughter's garden, Miss Marple, whose fondness for watching went hand in hand with her talent for noticing the unnoticed, witnessed something that tightened the noose of her own suspicions. Julia had walked swiftly, almost mechanically, up the gravel path to Ivy Bank Cottage, the letter gripped in her hand, not with casual curiosity, but with reluctant purpose, as though touching something that might bite. She vanished inside, then reappeared, moments later at the side window, her figure rigid with a quiet defiance that whispered of inner turmoil. The curtains, curiously, were left undrawn. Miss Marple, long practiced in the art of silent observation, saw her open the envelope with precise, almost surgical care. The paper inside, once unfolded, drew from Julia not a gasp nor a scream, but a subtle unraveling. Her hand quivered just enough, her posture slouched ever so slightly, as if whatever truth the letter contained had struck a place long barricaded within her. She read it again, this time slower, almost reverently, as though bracing herself for impact. Then, folding it meticulously, she placed it into her handbag with a finality that suggested this was no ordinary message. No tears, no dramatic collapse, just a woman whose face had momentarily forgotten how to lie. Miss Marple leaned back, her teacup untouched, her thoughts racing ahead of her heartbeat. A letter unopened too long, she mused, could be deadlier than poison, and this one had arrived with eerie precision. Meanwhile, the village began to buzz in hushed tones, not just about the letter but about the stranger who appeared not a day later, a man of slender build and quiet authority, whose French accent carried an odd grace that seemed almost theatrical amid the plainness of Lydney Marsh. Monsieur Delacour did not arrive with pomp but with the haunted poise of someone following the scent of unfinished business. He visited the vicarage and inquired, gently yet insistently, whether he might attend the funeral of Emmeline Grover, only to be informed to his visible dismay, that it had already occurred, with little ceremony and even less mourning. His brow furrowed, his mustache twitched with barely suppressed grief, and in a voice shadowed by memories he murmured, "But she had friends, many friends." He wasn't seeking sympathy, he was remembering, and the village, ever alert to emotional discord, took notice. By tea-time that very afternoon, he was the subject of every whispered theory and speculative glance. A friend of the deceased's husband, he had said, yet no one could explain what sort of friend arrives years after death and days before answers. Miss Marple, ever the quiet anchor in a storm of chatter, merely placed her teaspoon down and remarked with enigmatic softness that friendships forged before a war, especially that war, often outlasted time itself. No one quite grasped what she meant, but the words lingered, heavy with implications. Delacour for his part did not depart. Instead he took a room in the village, and was often seen wandering near Ivy Bank Cottage, gazing not at the garden or the house itself, but at the drawn curtains, as though behind them lay a question he had spent years rehearsing. His eyes did not wander like a tourist's, They were searching, recovering, remembering. In a place like Lydney Marsh, where memory was less a thing one owned than a thing one obeyed, such intent could not be ignored. If he had expected warmth from Julia, he received instead a coldness bordering on disdain. She acknowledged him only to confirm her aunt's death and to dismiss, without emotion, any suggestion of deeper ties. But something in the way she locked her door that evening, double bolting it though the village was safe, and something in the way she stood too long by the fire without stirring, it told Miss Marple all she needed to know. Some letters, she thought, were not written to inform, but to awaken. And some visitors didn't come seeking closure, they came to finish what had once begun. It wasn't the funeral that drew attention, those in Larkspur Hollow had long grown used to subdued departures, but rather the peculiar detachment with which Julia Langley handled her late aunt's passing, speaking of it as one might discuss the weather, impersonal and fading. She told the vicar's wife, almost absently, that her aunt had grown forgetful in recent years, prone to losing track of days, people, and occasionally entire conversations. Yet to Miss Agatha Penrose, who had learned over decades to weigh words not by their meaning, but by what was left unsaid, Julia's description had the polished edges of rehearsed dismissal, rather than genuine concern, the kind often used to tidy away women who had lived too long and remembered too much. So when a slender man with silvering temples and a refined near-vanishing French accent arrived days later, quietly asking after the deceased, and mentioning a small family heirloom, a porcelain-faced pendulum clock once entrusted to her during the war, Miss Penrose took note. His name was Monsieur Lucien Morel, and though he claimed only to be fulfilling a decades-old promise, his eyes held the haunted depth of a man who had come not for possession, but for closure. Julia's expression, cool and composed until that point, shifted ever so slightly when the clock was mentioned, not a flinch, not even surprise, just a subtle sharpening at the edges of her jaw, the kind of involuntary response the body gives before the mind can smooth it over. She claimed, without waiting to be asked, that her aunt had disposed of many trinkets in her final years, among them, a broken clock of no value. It was said too easily, with a studied carelessness that tasted more of evasion than truth. Miss Penrose had heard such tones before, polished, practiced, and almost always hiding something. Later she found herself remembering Emmeline Langley, not as the frail shadow she had become, but as the woman once known for her elegant soirée, where French sonatas drifted through Ivy Hollow Cottage, and a circle of refined guests listened raptly to her play Debussy, with fingers that seemed to translate memory into sound. Back then, she was known as Mademoiselle Delphine, her laughter lilting like glass in sunlight, her presence radiant, and her past only whispered about. Then, without announcement, the music ceased. She married Harold Langley, a stiff and unimaginative man with connections and no discernible warmth. Slowly the light dimmed from her eyes, the guests stopped coming, and the piano gathered dust. No one ever questioned it, not aloud. But now, with Monsieur Morel standing in the shadow of that history, and Julia growing visibly tense behind every carefully chosen word, the silence surrounding Emmeline's past began to feel less like the result of age, and more like a curtain deliberately drawn. Morel, when pressed gently, spoke of the clock not as a relic, but as a promise, a gift entrusted to his mother's friend, when escape from occupied France was no longer possible. The letter, he said, had been written in a tone warm with memory, not just cordiality, and he had kept it for years, waiting for the right time to reclaim, not the object, but the sentiment it represented. And still Julia denied all knowledge. No such letter, no such clock. Perhaps, she said, it had been sold, or misplaced, or broken beyond repair. Miss Penrose, who believed that some truths were too dangerous to discard, and too precious to reveal, watched her closely. The clock, if it existed, was more than metal and gears. It was a witness, perhaps to a loyalty unspoken, a love forbidden, or a secret too large to survive translation. And now, with Emmeline gone, and the last thread of that forgotten war memory tightening around Ivy Hollow Cottage, Miss Penrose suspected that someone wasn't just protecting the past, they were trying to bury it. But the past, she knew, has a peculiar way of ticking back to life. It was on a pale Thursday morning, beneath a sky more cloud than light, that Mrs. Eloine Brent made her way along the narrow gravel path, flanking the Witherstone estate, ostensibly to deliver a jar of fig preserve to the rector's sister, but in truth, guided by a more intangible hunger, the kind that prickles at the edge of the mind, when something is not quite right. The estate, once bustling with the late Dr. Linwood's botanical lectures and peculiar foreign visitors, now sat hushed, draped in an unsettling neatness that felt more staged than serene. Its new mistress, Caroline Linwood, niece and sole inheritor, had arrived from abroad only weeks prior, and yet her handling of the deceased's belongings was, by village standards, hasty to the point of impolite. Caroline, with her polished manners and opaque eyes, had spoken little of her uncle save to describe him as eccentric and rather reclusive. A statement Elowen noted was both accurate and insufficient, like describing a blizzard as chilly. When asked, she had claimed there were no significant items of value left behind, only sentimental oddities, maps of ruined cities, dried herbs in parchment packets, and a peculiar bronze compass that never quite pointed north. And yet, just days before his death, Dr. Linwood had told the grocer's boy, who was far too young to understand the weight of words, that some things ought never be unearthed, even with the best intentions. Such warnings tend to evaporate in sunlight, but Elowen had never forgotten them. And so, under the gentle guise of helpfulness, she offered her services to Caroline, who, though hesitant, relented with the polite stiffness of someone too proud to seem secretive. The house's interior was curiously void of personality, like a museum of living where all the exhibits had been scrubbed of history. No misplaced spectacles, no half-read papers, just order. But it was not order born of domestic pride, Elowen sensed. It was the kind that comes after chaos, meticulously arranged to conceal it. And then there was the smell, not of dust, but of ash and lavender oil, an unsettling combination that clung to the drawing room despite the open windows. While assisting in reorganizing a set of cabinets, each drawer already too precisely arranged, Elowen noticed the hearth, cold, spotless, and yet bearing a faint metallic scent, like scorched foil. With a subtle flick of her gloved hand, she lifted the grate's iron lip and, hidden beneath the softest layer of grey ash, found a single twisted remnant, a metal clasp, half melted, bearing the insignia of a continental society no longer in existence. Nearby, a curl of scorched paper resisted the flame's full consumption. The lettering, elegant, slanted, hinted at French origin. Caroline had spoken of no correspondence, and certainly no visits from anyone abroad, yet the letter's phrasing, even in fragments, suggested urgency and intimacy. Elowen's heart, seasoned by years of listening more than speaking, beat with the steady rhythm of intuition. Whatever had been burned, had not been meant for public eyes. But why burn it so incompletely? Why leave a clasp, a clue, in a house so otherwise scrubbed of memory? And why, above all, had Caroline insisted no such things ever existed? People do not erase the past for fun, Elowen thought. They do it to hide. And often what they hide is not shame, but something far more dangerous. That night, while the rest of the village dined and debated the price of eggs, Elowen sat at her window, the burned clasp beside her, listening to the wind tug at the ivy with the desperation of secrets long denied, and now clawing their way to the surface. The air in Bramble Hollow was unusually dry that day, as if the dust of an old memory had begun to stir. A faint, acrid scent lingered inside the stone chimney of the old cottage, like the ghost of something that had been deliberately turned to ash. Miss Adelaide Winthrop, known among the villagers as a quiet and gracious woman, had come by under the modest pretext of returning a shawl after the passing of Margaret Trevelyan. But in truth, something else had driven her here, a suspicion that had been quietly coiling in the corners of her mind for years, now finally rising to the surface. Her hands moved with calm purpose, pretending to tidy up, when her eyes caught something half buried in the soot of the fireplace, the charred fragment of a photo frame, tucked just out of sight, as if someone had tried to destroy it quickly, yet not without hesitation. She reached in and carefully retrieved it, her gloved fingers brushing ash from the edges, revealing the faint burned outline of a photograph. Though blackened, the image still held recognizable forms, a woman, young and radiant, and beside her, a tall man with a smile that was unmistakably intimate. Not the smile of polite acquaintance, but the kind reserved for someone cherished. Time had eaten away at most of the picture, but not enough to erase the identity of the man, Captain Lucian Hartwell. A name long thought lost to the tides of war, a name never once spoken by Margaret. The photo's casual, unguarded nature betrayed the depth of a relationship that had never been meant for public eyes. This was no commemorative snapshot, this was a quiet confession preserved in film. But the question clawed at her: if this photograph had been hidden for so long, why destroy it now? What fear, even now, lingered deep enough to warrant such erasure? Some truths, it seemed, grew heavier with time, not lighter. Later, when Margaret's niece Clara stepped outside to take a phone call, Miss Winthrop seized the moment her instincts had been waiting for. She moved silently to the corner of the drawing room, where the old piano stood cloaked in silence. Its once rich varnish had dulled with time, but something about its presence still spoke of a long-buried story. She slid the bench aside, and lifted the piano's lid, finding what she expected: yellowed sheet music, a torn hymn book, and a brittle metronome. But beneath them, she sensed something more, a hidden depth that didn't belong. Her fingers gently pressed along the inner panel, until she heard a soft click. A concealed compartment opened. Inside, wrapped in delicate faded silk, and tied with a blue ribbon now turned pale with age, were letters that had somehow survived when all else had been erased. These were not fragments of a casual correspondence. They pulsed with emotion, like living veins pressed between pages. Just then, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Llewellyn, arrived with her usual, saccharine poise. The two women exchanged no words but shared a knowing glance. Together they untied the ribbon with the reverence of unveiling a relic from a tomb. The letters were written in French, their elegant script filled with longing, urgency, and a desperation that no borders could restrain. Captain Lucian's words bled not only with love but with shadows of war, codes hidden behind piano compositions, promises made during blackouts, whispers exchanged under the looming eye of betrayal. With each letter, the layers of their bond unfolded, at first tender and breathless, then darker, stormier, tainted with secrets that could fracture nations. As the correspondence progressed, the tone shifted, color gave way to shadow. The final letters bore not just sorrow, but guilt and betrayal. Lucian confessed not only to giving away his heart, but to surrendering knowledge far more dangerous, knowledge that could tip the balance of wartime allegiances. This wasn't merely an affair, it was espionage disguised as devotion, escape hidden within intimacy, and Margaret had chosen to bury it all in silence. But on the eve of her death, she'd tried to burn away the last thread tying her to that chapter, without realizing that the ashes too could still speak. As Miss Winthrop closed the final letter, she felt it. Bramble Hollow wasn't just steeped in grief, it echoed with the kind of silence born only in places where hearts had turned their secrets into graves. Standing before the long muted piano, she understood something profound. The story wasn't over, it was waiting quietly, patiently, for someone to bring its heartbeat back to life. A strange hush had settled over the village, thick as velvet and just as suffocating, the kind that preceded storms or revelations. Beneath the brittle flicker of candlelight, a single phrase echoed through every trembling line of the final letter: Laytel, the eternal debt. The words pulsed with quiet dread, looping endlessly in the reader's mind, haunted and sharp. The letter bore no date, only a trembling urgency, as though its very ink had been hurried through shaking hands. Henri de Vallière, the Frenchman cloaked in whispers and lingering glances, had written of a truth long buried, one he had never dared speak while Emmeline breathed. He warned of its weight, apologized for the pain it might tear open, yet insisted that it must rise, must breathe again, even here across the sea, in the soil of a village not its own. Miss Mirabelle Thorncroft read the letter aloud in a voice both fragile and firm, while the Reverend's wife, pale as linen, pressed her handkerchief to her lips, the implications falling around them like ash from a long-dead fire. This was no idle confession, no hidden affair of hearts. This was a guilt so profound it had calcified into silence. And now, with Emmeline's passing, that silence had cracked. The fog rolled in at dawn like an omen, winding through hedges and hollows, wrapping the village of Blackthorn Hollow in a dreamlike veil. And with the fog came news, whispered first, then carried like shattered porcelain. Henri de Vallière, had been found lifeless beneath the withering bloom of the old rose trellis behind Ashgrace Cottage. It was the gardener, Thomas Quill, young and sharp-eyed, who stumbled upon him, his boots sinking into dew-drenched soil as he stepped back in alarm from the vines. Henry's body was twisted unnaturally, one hand open to the sky, his cravat askew, and a single boot resting half off as though someone had tried to pull him back, too late. Crimson rose petals lay crushed beside him, soft contrast to the brutal stillness of his final form. The village doctor, unaccustomed to such grim theatre, declared it a tragic fall, the neck broken clean. No signs of violence, no weapon, no resistance, only a man, a wall, and the morning mist. Yet the story unsettled the women who knew better. Henry was not a man to wander unfamiliar gardens at dawn, nor to misstep so carelessly in boots made for walking. Miss Thorncroft, when informed, said nothing, but her knitting paused mid-loop, her gaze shifted toward the half-packed travel case in the corner, and her plans to return to Elmbridge quietly dissolved. For there is something profoundly unnatural about men who die among roses, and explanations that come too neatly wrapped in fog. She walked the path alone that afternoon, her steps careful, slow. The earth beneath the trellis was soft, yes, but not disturbed. The garden wall, low though it was, bore no mark of passage, no scuff of sole, no bent moss, yet the roses told a tale, their thorns caught in themselves, one stem freshly snapped. The body, she noted, had not collapsed in chaos, but lay with eerie precision, as though gently arranged. Beneath Henry's hip, oddly crushed and overlooked, was a second boot, unlike the one he wore yesterday, and on his wrist, a narrow red line, too shallow to defend, too intentional to ignore, like the echo of a hand that had lingered too long. Most unsettling of all, however, was what was missing. The notebook, Henry's constant companion, the one he'd been seen with only the day before, scribbling quietly beneath the elm, was gone, as if someone had not only claimed his breath, but ensured the truth he so feared to speak would remain unspoken. And Miss Thorncroft, eyes narrowing as the wind stirred the petals at her feet, knew this was no accident. This was a message, and someone, somewhere in the village, was praying desperately that it would never be understood. Miss Evelyn Ashcroft, poised as ever in her crisp grey shawl and thin gloves despite the rising spring warmth, did not contradict the inspector as he stood in the drawing-room reciting his mechanical report, voice devoid of emotion, eyes fixed anywhere but hers, as he muttered of slippery paths, unfortunate angles, and an old man's fading sense of balance. She merely nodded, murmured her thanks, and closed the door behind him, but deep within her mind, a darker, more intricate picture had begun to paint itself, one not softened by the fog, nor numbed by accident, but sharpened by intent, tethered to fear, and etched with the kind of silence that only thrives when secrets rot just beneath the surface. Evelyn had long understood that death is rarely punctual, never polite, and almost always arrives where old truths sleep uneasily. The village, as expected, began to hum with unease by evening, the kind that seeps through cracks in windows, and clings to laundry lines like a storm that refuses to break. At the baker's, Mrs. Colfax could be heard, speaking just a bit too loudly about Arabella Knox, Emmeline Grover's orphaned niece, insisting she had seen her pacing nervously near the chapel the night before the unfortunate Mr. Claude Duval was found dead. Her shoes muddy, her face unusually pale. Meanwhile, the paperboy claimed to have seen Mr. Duval slip something into the poor box before vanishing down the lane, a note or envelope perhaps now mysteriously vanished. Then a retired postman mentioned, with the quiet certainty of a man who never forgot a face, that Claude had visited the village once before, in 1947, and had left abruptly after speaking with the late Emmeline, in what he described as a conversation with the weight of war in it. Evelyn listened to it all, not to indulge, but to interpret, knowing too well that village gossip was like a river, shallow at first glance, but deep where the current twisted hardest. Arabella's calm demeanor, during the days that followed, had been noted by all. Her hands never trembled as she brewed tea, her voice never cracked when asked about the body found near the arbor, but Evelyn saw the cracks, faint and hairline, in the corners of her eyes, in the delay before answering, in the faint smell of burnt parchment one morning before breakfast. That night, Evelyn returned to the garden alone, not driven by ghoulish fascination, but by the unfinished edges of something that didn't sit right. The arrangement of Claude's limbs too perfect, the absence of his cane too peculiar, and a curious fold in the rug by the garden bench where no feet had passed. Under the moonlight, she retraced the steps and found, beneath the bench carved by Emmeline's late husband during the war, a loosened stone barely held by the creeping moss. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth, and hidden in the hollow below, lay an old military tin, dulled with time but sealed shut. She pried it open to reveal a single letter, the paper yellowed, the ink foreign, French, she noted, with careful phrasing that suggested both desperation and control. It did not speak of romance as one might expect, but of betrayal, guilt, and a deal made under duress. If you do not come, Emmeline, it read, they will speak, and if they speak everything ends, for you, for me, for what we once dared dream. Signed, CD dated 1945. Evelyn's breath caught, not because of the name, but because the date fell exactly 1 year after Emmeline's secret hospital stay, which had never been explained, and which the doctor had filed away as a nervous collapse. Suddenly, the strange behavior made sense, the abrupt end to correspondence with the continent, the way Emmeline had shuttered entire rooms of the house and forbade entry to the arbor. But more than that, Evelyn knew then that Claude had not returned to the village merely to haunt old ghosts. He had come to claim something that had been denied to him, perhaps justice, perhaps redemption, or perhaps a final confrontation with a past both he and Emmeline had tried so hard to bury. And as Evelyn looked up, sensing movement in the hedgerow beyond the stone path, just the faintest shuffle, a breath held in the dark, she realized with a chill that someone else had been watching all along. Not merely watching, but waiting. Because in places like these, truth never stays buried for long, and those who dig too deep often find themselves pulled down with what they uncover. Evelyn, holding the letter close, turned slowly, knowing now that the real story had only just begun, and that every step forward would be like walking a garden path whose stones had been laid not with care but with consequence. When Mr. Ellison Graves stepped off the early afternoon train, a crisp wind curling around his overcoat, and the faint scent of damp earth in the air, the villagers of Windmere Hollow felt a disturbance they couldn't quite name. Not the kind that rushes in with noise, but the slow, deliberate kind that unsettles in silence. The solicitor's shoes, polished to an obsessive shine, tapped too confidently against cobblestones not used to strangers, and his sharp grey eyes didn't linger on the quaint bakery window, or the ivy-laced church spire like other occasional visitors did. Instead, he moved like a man, burdened not by grief, but by revelation. His arrival was not the whisper of morning, but the click of inevitability. Without a single word wasted on the weather or the village's sleepy charm, he made his way to the rectory where Clara Hemsley awaited, dressed in her usual pastel restraint, her eyes already bracing for something she pretended not to fear. By the time tea had cooled in Mrs. Embley's china cups across town, the village was already buzzing in low tones about the contents of Mr. Graves' briefcase, which once unlatched revealed not the expected legal formalities, but a single parchment yellowed folded precisely, and inked with urgency. The will had been discovered not among the tidy estate files, but inside a hidden compartment beneath a false-bottom drawer in Eliza Penbrook's study, suggesting a deliberate concealment, a secret meant only for the right hands, or perhaps no hands at all. Clara, for all her rehearsed composure, had not masked the tremor that rippled through her as the name Honora Vale was read aloud, the sole beneficiary of Eliza's modest yet meaningful estate, including the rose-covered cottage, and a collection of rare heirlooms believed to be destined for Clara. The name rang through the room like a bell heard in a dream, unfamiliar, yet curiously weighted, like something once known but long buried. Clara denied any knowledge of this Honora, her voice steady, yet her eyes flickering toward the document, as though trying to will the name off the page. Graves remained impassive, though his brief glance at her suggested he sensed the fracture beneath her poise. The will bore Eliza's distinctive script, and was signed by an unexpected witness, Benjamin R. Blythe, a name with long-forgotten roots in the village's darker history, a man who had vanished during the war after whispers of betrayal and scandal, presumed drowned but never found. What business had he with Eliza in her final months? And why had he been chosen to validate her final wishes? These were not questions Clara asked, at least not aloud, but Miss Linton, watching the rain drizzle against her parlor window, already sensed that the name Honora Vale had awoken something old and dangerous. It was not uncommon for secrets to fester in villages like Windmere Hollow, where smiles were often stitched over silence, and grief lived quietly behind locked doors. But this was not just a secret, it was a resurrection. A photograph, once perched on Eliza's mantel, came to mind, a child with dark curls and solemn eyes, long since removed, and spoken of only once, cryptically, as the one we never spoke of. Was Honora that child? An illegitimate daughter, a shadow from Eliza's youth, or worse, someone Clara had long worked to forget? The name had not merely disrupted the inheritance, it had fractured the illusion of familiarity that the village wrapped around its memories. And as dusk began to gather, and the solicitor's carriage disappeared down the misty lane, Miss Linton sat still in her armchair, the fire crackling low, already feeling the shape of the puzzle unfolding in her mind. For wills written in secrecy were not written out of whimsy, they were written with intention, often desperation, and the dead rarely reached back from the grave, unless something had been left unfinished. Whatever Clara was hiding, it was about to surface, and Windmere Hollow would never be the same. Of all the secrets buried in the damp soil of Ashmere Hollow, none throbbed with such haunting urgency as the name Evelyn Thorne, a name never spoken aloud, never etched in stone, yet echoing faintly in the creak of floorboards and the hush that followed certain questions. Her existence had long been swallowed by time, deliberately scrubbed from family records and erased from parlor whispers, as though her memory were a contagion better left undisturbed. But when the iron-willed matriarch Agnes Thorne died, and the reading of her will revealed a cryptic line, "To the one forgotten, whose music still echoes beneath the garden stones, I leave the silver locket," a cold current passed through the drawing-room. Lillian, Agnes's only surviving heir, flinched almost imperceptibly, though her voice remained sharp and controlled as a scalpel when she declared, "There is no Evelyn. My great-aunt had no sister. It's a clerical error." But Miss Ellery, seated quietly in the corner like a shadow made flesh, watched her closely, saw the way her fingers twisted the hem of her sleeve, how her gaze lingered a second too long on the closed piano in the adjacent room, as if remembering something too dangerous to admit. That evening, while the rest of the household busied themselves with feigned mourning, Miss Ellery wandered the old East Wing, led more by instinct than evidence. The corridor breathed mildew and memory, its air heavy with unshed grief. She reached the music room once said to be Evelyn's sanctuary, its door padlocked for decades, but the key, forgotten or purposely ignored, still rested behind the cracked portrait of Agnes as a girl, a portrait suspiciously painted with only one child, despite rumors of two. Inside, dust choked the air like secrets finally stirred. The piano stood untouched, solemn, as though waiting for fingers that would never return. She opened the bench with quiet ceremony, revealing yellowed sheet music, and beneath it, a stiff pink ribbon curled with age. Something was buried deeper, a floorboard loosened with careful pressure. From that hollow, she drew a diary wrapped in silk, its pages trembling with suppressed truth. The handwriting, delicate and looping, belonged to Evelyn. She wrote of music, of love, of despair, of Agnes's growing distance, and a scandal never named, but clearly endured. One passage chilled Miss Ellery to her core. "They said I embarrassed the family, that my heart played wrong notes, so they locked away my songs, and then they locked away me." The final entry mentioned the locket, and a place where the lilacs bend toward the sun, and silence grows like vines. The next morning, beneath the aching quiet of dawn, Miss Ellery found herself in the garden, now wild with thorns and vines, where the sundial stood askew among overgrown lilacs. She knelt, her gloved hands pushing aside ivy so thick it felt purposeful. Beneath a loose stone lay a rusted tin box, inside it a silver locket, and within that, a photograph. Two girls, arms interlinked, one with Agnes's rigid smile, the other with eyes that seemed to sing Evelyn. But it was the torn sheet of music inside that truly unraveled the facade. The last nocturne, a haunting melody signed E. Thorne, with a blood-red scrawl across the margin. They took my voice, but the song will remain. And as Miss Ellery looked around the garden, the way the ivy curved unnaturally, almost like a grave marker woven from green, she realized Evelyn hadn't disappeared, she had been silenced. The hollow hadn't forgotten her, it had absorbed her. The garden itself had become her mausoleum, her memory stitched into every petal and vine, and now that the locket had surfaced, so too would the questions, and perhaps if the house allowed it, the long-dead answers Evelyn had once begged the lilacs to keep. The garden behind the old Everbrook estate had always appeared too carefully wild, vines trained to seem untamed, flowers arranged to look accidental, and stone pathways veiled beneath ivy, that clung not by chance but by long habit, as though it had been whispered where to root and where to cover. Beneath the hush of rustling leaves and the weight of time, Eliza Merton, no stranger to secrets, ran her fingers along the chilled stone wall until her touch traced something unnatural, a faint depression in the soil that seemed too intentional for nature's hand. One of the stones had clearly shifted more recently than the others, and though her instincts screamed to uncover it then and there, she paused. It was not yet time. The cryptic letter she had received, unsigned and yellowed with age, had led her here with maddening precision. Where silence takes root and memory sleeps, there lies what they buried twice. She felt it in her bones, the truth pulsed just beneath the surface. When she returned the next day, this time with DCI Hartley, a man both skeptical and stubborn, the light had shifted. The garden, bathed in golden dusk, seemed almost complicit. Hartley, reluctant to disturb what looked like a child's forgotten corner of paradise, eventually gave in to Eliza's quiet resolve. As they lifted the ivy-laced stone, the soil gave way to a hollow space, disturbingly neat, the outline of a small grave, unmistakable, and too well preserved to be chance. No weeds, no roots, just soft black earth, like a wound kept hidden but tended. And though no marker remained, a fragment of rotted wood with faint burn marks suggested that one had once stood proudly before someone tried to erase it. Eliza's breath caught, but she said nothing, her mind already assembling the clues. The sealed room in the West Wing, the forgotten portrait of a child who never aged, and the line in the journal she had found hidden in the piano bench. They said I was never born, so I disappeared. Hartley began to speak, but she stilled him with a glance, her eyes fixed on the grave, like it might speak if given silence. Hours later, as evening crept over the vicarage, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret Belrose, the once stoic governess, who had long since disappeared from public life, stepped in with a leather satchel clutched like it held her heartbeat. Her lips were tight, but her eyes brimmed with something brittle. "You found it, didn't you?" she said, not as a question, but a reckoning. Eliza gave a slow nod. "Yes, we did." For a long moment Margaret didn't move, then finally exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for decades. "It wasn't murder," she whispered, "but it wasn't mercy either." Her voice cracked, and her gaze fell to the floor. "The child was never supposed to be. A mistake, they said. A consequence of shame. They called her the Shadow." Eliza leaned forward, her voice low, and laced with ice. "What was her name?" Margaret hesitated, then opened the satchel, and handed Eliza a brittle birth certificate. "Aurelia Merton, daughter of Eleanor Belrose." The name was a match. The timeline was not. Eleanor would have been 12. Eliza felt the breath leave her as the weight of buried legacies pressed in. This hadn't just been a forgotten child. This was a lineage rewritten in fear. And the garden, so beautifully deceptive, had been complicit, nurturing a lie for over 40 years. But no lie can bloom forever. Now, under the rising moon and with Hartley's silent awe beside her, Eliza realized what lay beneath was more than a grave. It was a doorway, and something had just knocked from the other side. The room was heavy with a silence that felt almost sacred, as if the air itself knew a terrible truth was finally breaking free after years of suffocating silence. Eleanor Hargrove, sat upright in the drawing-room of the Ashmore estate, the fire crackling faintly behind her, as shadows danced across the old wallpaper like ghostly reminders of all that had been hidden for decades. Her face, once admired for its composure, now trembled with the weight of unspoken guilt, her eyes flickering not with sadness, but with the raw panic of someone who had finally run out of places to bury the past. Across from her sat the ever-observant Mrs. Ashcroft, whose gentle voice and grandmotherly presence often made people underestimate her, but not today. Today, Eleanor could feel the heat of that gaze, not judgmental, but sharp, precise, and impossible to escape. Inspector Merrin stood quietly by the door, arms crossed, absorbing every word with that calm intensity only a seasoned investigator can maintain. And then, like a stone dropped in still water, Eleanor's voice shattered the quiet. It wasn't an accident. She didn't fall. She was pushed. The words seemed to linger, echoed in the wide eyes of those present, and yet Eleanor didn't stop. Her voice wavered but pushed forward, like something long held back now refusing to be silenced. We were all there that night. The celebration, the noise, the thunder outside. No one saw her slip. That's what we told everyone. But it was a lie. Henley saw. He knew, and he threatened to tell. Her hands clutched the armrest of the chair, as if bracing herself against the memories. Years passed. We thought it was over. And then, the letters came. Anonymous, cruel, precise. They didn't just describe what happened. They described how it felt. The fear, the moment of hesitation. It was someone who was there, someone who saw more than they should have. Mrs. Ashcroft's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. It wasn't Henley, was it? Eleanor froze. For a moment her eyes widened, like a child, caught in a lie too old to remember the beginning of. No, she whispered. He died, before he could tell anyone. It was someone else, someone who stayed close, who watched every year, as we pretended everything was fine. She swallowed hard. I thought if I destroyed the letters it would end, but they kept coming. Tucked into books, under my pillow, once even hidden in the folds of my gloves. Her voice cracked then. They knew, they wanted me to confess, but I couldn't, until now. She looked down, ashamed, her hands trembling. I didn't push her, but I saw who did, and I lied. I helped hide the truth. We all did. There was a long pause as the flames in the fireplace hissed softly, like the house itself disapproving of the words being spoken aloud. Then Mrs. Ashcroft calmly reached beside her, and produced a worn leather folio, the one she had discovered, hidden behind the grandfather clock in the east corridor. You mean this? She said softly. Eleanor stared at it, and the blood drained from her face. You found it, she said barely above a whisper. Inside the folio was not only one of the threatening letters but also a torn journal page, written in a trembling hand, dated just 2 days before the child's death. It spoke not only of fear, but of betrayal, and of someone close, so close they could have reached out and stopped it, but chose instead to turn away. Inspector Merrin stepped forward now, slowly, the tension in the room thickening. You're saying someone inside this house has known all along? He asked. Eleanor nodded, tears glistening now. Yes, and they're still here, watching. Her voice dropped into something close to a whisper. And if I'm speaking the truth now, it's not because I found courage, it's because I know they're not done yet. Silence followed, not the silence of conclusion, but of dread. Because the past, it seemed, wasn't buried. It was alive, awake and ready to strike again. And as the storm began to stir once more outside the estate's ivy-covered walls, the truth, like a specter long denied, had finally clawed its way to the surface. But the question that lingered, cold and unforgiving, was whether it had come alone. Everything, Evelyn Greystone said, her voice carrying the eerie calm that settles right before a storm, not angry, not anxious, just cold and heavy, with the weight of truths long buried. Everything that led us here, and everything that was hidden beneath the soil for decades. Her words lingered in the air like smoke, thick with implication, and for a moment, the room felt like it was holding its breath, as though the truth itself had unsettled the walls. Across from her, Isadora Lane's usually unreadable face showed the first flicker of something fragile. Her hands trembled slightly, and her jaw tightened just enough to betray the crack in her composure. Evelyn's tone didn't change. It remained clinical, sharp, almost surgical, like a scalpel slicing through scar tissue. It began during the war, she continued, her eyes never leaving Isadora's. When Celeste Harrow, your grandmother, met a man who would change everything. Lucien Moreau, a rebel, a deserter, and the man who stole not just her heart, but her entire future. Evelyn watched the flicker of recognition flash in Isadora's eyes, the tightening of her throat. Celeste was promised to Alaric Lane, the perfect match, the perfect future. But when the bombs were falling, and people were starving, it wasn't Alaric she turned to. It was Lucien, and what they shared in those nights of fear and fire. It wasn't just passion, it was dangerous, forbidden. And when the war ended, she came back, but not alone. Evelyn paused, letting the silence drag, like a blade over porcelain.
She brought back a secret, a child.
No one ever saw that child. No record, no name, just a small patch of earth at the far end of the garden, where the grass never grows, where the soil is always just a little too soft. Isadora's breath caught in her throat. She buried more than her past, Evelyn whispered. She buried the truth. And when Lucien came back years later, not with vengeance, not with hate, but with questions, with apologies, with the ache of a man searching for the child he never met. What did you do? Evelyn stepped forward, her voice low, relentless. You called him insane. You destroyed the letters, the photos, the DNA results, everything. Why? Because you were afraid that the legacy you built, the house, the name, the image, was built on a lie. And when lies collapse, they don't just take down walls, they take down everything. Isadora had turned pale, her lips trembling now, but there was something else in her eyes too, the exhaustion of carrying a secret for far too long. I only wanted to protect what we had, she whispered, each word sounding like a confession pressed through grief. I didn't want people to know that my grandmother once lived a life where love was a sin, and sin ruined everything. Evelyn leaned in slightly, her finger pointing toward the ivy-covered corner of the garden just beyond the window. But Isadora, she said, her voice harder now, you didn't protect the truth. You buried it, just like Celeste did. And when Lucien came back with nothing but the truth in his hands, you buried him too. Silence fell again, heavier this time. But it wasn't the silence of uncertainty, it was the kind that comes before reckoning. This story wasn't returning for forgiveness, it had come back for justice. Clarissa Harlowe sat motionless, her porcelain face strained and pale, as if sculpted from sorrow itself, the delicate illusion of strength she had worn for so long finally beginning to crack, under the weight of everything she had concealed. Her eyes, once sharp with command, now shimmered with something far more human, the fragility of someone who had spent a lifetime preserving appearances at the cost of her own soul. Across from her, the air was heavy, not just with accusation, but with the echo of decades-old silence breaking open like a long-sealed crypt. As the clock ticked mercilessly on the wall, Lady Winifred Vale, who had quietly observed this unraveling, found her thoughts spiraling, not toward judgment, but toward the quiet, aching realization that what had unfolded was not born of malice, but of wounds stitched shut with fear. This was not the work of a villain in the traditional sense, but the desperate actions of a woman trapped by inheritance, by scandal, and by a past that had never truly died. Clarissa, for all her icy reserve, had been shaped by a single moment, one buried deep in the family's forgotten ledger, a moment involving a child, a scandal, and a terrible choice made in the name of reputation. And like ivy creeping through stone, that choice had threaded through generations, distorting truths, silencing voices, and eventually collapsing into the tragedy before them. The return of Aurelia Blackmore, a woman once presumed dead, now risen from the ashes of gossip and ruin, had reopened every sealed door, every wound Clarissa thought long faded. Yet Aurelia had returned not with vengeance, but with a song, a quiet insistence that the truth be known, however ruinous. Clarissa's fear had not been of guilt, but of exposure, for in exposing the lie surrounding her sister's supposed disappearance, the whole illusion of the Harlowe legacy would crumble. So she had protected it, ruthlessly, silently, even lovingly, but in doing so, she had become the architect of the very collapse she feared. Lady Winifred, though no stranger to scandal's shadow, could see now that Clarissa's real punishment had always been internal. Years of self-imposed exile beneath the mask of authority, the loneliness of carrying a truth too dangerous to name. As Clarissa was led gently from the drawing room, her steps slow, her head bowed, not in disgrace, but in long overdue release, Winifred felt a hollow ache settle beneath her ribs. Justice, it seemed, had finally come, not as a blade, but as a mirror. Outside, the once withered wisteria had begun to bloom again, defiant and lush against the old manor walls, its petals trembling in the breeze like whispers finally spoken. The estate, no longer suffocating beneath secrets, would now pass to an artist's trust, a place for broken women to heal and create, not a monument to what was lost, but a beginning for something honest and new. And as the first light of summer spilled across the floorboards, Winifred closed her eyes for a moment, and breathed in the scent of wisteria and rain, because even in the aftermath of buried truths, beauty had found a way to grow. There was a silence in the afternoon air, the kind that lingers only around old estates, as if time itself had paused, and every corner, every creak in the wood carried the weight of stories never told. Eleanor Cartwright, visiting Wrenmore Hollow for just a few days to inspect the inheritance left by her late aunt, stood behind the tall ivy-draped wall overlooking the garden. The flowers still bloomed, yes, but their roots fed on secrets, long buried, quietly festering, now clawing their way back toward the surface. The house was hers now, yet with it came a heaviness, a haunting legacy folded deep into its foundation. And then on a rainy night, as soft droplets tapped against the windows, a letter slid silently under her bedroom door. No stamp, no postmark, just a name inked in aged handwriting. The rosewood pact still breathes. The words meant nothing to her, yet they stirred something ancient, something veiled, as though the walls themselves had been waiting for her return. That letter led her into a shadowed past, into whispers of a hidden child, a shattered identity, and a circle of women who had once bound themselves to a vow, a pact sealed in pain and secrecy. Late that night, behind a loose panel in the hallway closet, she found a rusted key, small and old, with the weight of forgotten sins, and as she descended into the estate's long-abandoned cellar, the air turned colder, heavier, as though time had congealed into the very stones beneath her feet. There were no wine bottles or antique treasures, only dust-covered journals, a scratched tape recorder, and a photograph, her Aunt Cecily holding a child, with another woman standing beside her, whose face had been deliberately scorched away. Each diary, each whispered recording pieced together the true nature of the Rosewood Pact, a secret alliance among women determined to vanish from a world that had stolen their choices, shielding their children from the same fate by hiding them away, even from their own identities. But most chilling of all was a note at the final page of a journal. If the child ever returns, don't let him see a mirror, he'll remember everything. Eleanor dropped the paper. Somewhere beyond the cracked mirrors and crooked staircases, the past had begun to wake. The next day, a stranger arrived claiming to be a real estate appraiser, but something about him was off, too curious, too calm. Around his neck hung a locket identical to the one buried with Aunt Cecily. He smiled politely, but there was something unreadable in his eyes, something old. Eleanor knew then, this wasn't just the end of her aunt's story, this was the beginning of her own. The house hadn't given up its secrets, it had only opened the first door, and now within its creaking walls the whispers had found their voice again. Some truths, she realized, don't stay buried, some wait, patiently, for the right soul to return and remember. Shame, unlike truth or justice, has a peculiar grip over the human heart. It coils itself around memory, tightens with time, and buries what ought never be forgotten under layers of silence. And for Lydia Harrow, that silence became a sanctuary and a prison both. Belgrave Hollow, the sprawling manor tucked deep within the withered arms of Greywick Forest, had long ceased to feel like home. It pulsed like a living thing, heavy with secrets, echoing with the whispers of events never fully spoken aloud. When Eleanor Vale arrived to handle the estate after her godmother's mysterious death, she expected dust, maybe grief, but not the chilling weight of unresolved terror that clung to every room like smoke. The locals greeted her with politeness, yes, but behind their eyes lay a fear that had been nurtured over decades, the kind born not from ghost stories but from truths too grotesque to face. The manor, beautiful yet decaying, bore signs of a past deliberately concealed: shuttered wings, portraits turned toward the walls, an attic bolted shut with rusted chains and no clear reason. But Eleanor was not easily swayed by superstition. What unnerved her more were the gaps in Lydia's diaries, the pages torn out in anger, the ink smeared by trembling hands, and the final tape, hidden beneath the floorboards, where Lydia's voice, frail and distant, unraveled a truth that had slept for 28 years. Iris Lennox hadn't vanished into thin air at the 1997 Spring Gala. She had been hidden, lied about, and ultimately silenced by the very people meant to protect her. It wasn't hate that had led to it, but fear, the fear of reputations ruined, of lives unmade by one terrible mistake, and above all, the fear of confronting who they had become. Eleanor found herself holding more than a mystery. She held the weight of an entire town's collusion, a web of guilt spun so tight that even the innocent looked complicit. And yet, what haunted her most wasn't the horror itself, but the quiet grace in Lydia's voice as she begged, not for forgiveness, but for someone, someday, to simply tell the truth. In that moment, Eleanor realized the story was never just about Iris, or Lydia, or even Belgrave. It was about the lies families tell to survive, the history that festers when unspoken, and the cost of silence passed down like inheritance. So now we ask you, if you stood in Eleanor's shoes, knowing that revealing the truth could destroy families, but also liberate long-buried pain, would you stay silent, or would you speak, knowing the past never truly dies unless it is faced? Tell us what you would have done. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if the chilling truth behind Belgrave Hollow gripped you as it did us, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting tales, where every silence hides a scream, and every locked room hides a secret just waiting to be heard.